it is a time of crisis, and it is a time of us to communicate. And I think we're all here because we keenly realize that in a time of crisis, everything we say has added gravity to it, has added significance. It's even more important that we reach out to clients. And our position of leadership, both as leaders of our clients, as stewards of client relationships, and our position of leadership as leaders of our teams, of our people, of our departments, of our firms, is emphasized. That leadership is needed even more. And as always, I'll jump right to the conclusion of this presentation, is that it is critically important that we communicate in order to maintain the trust of our clients. And very importantly, not only to address how they feel in a crisis, how they feel today, but also to work with clients to help set the stage for how they will remember what happened. It's not about just what's happening today, it's also about how they will remember these events, and therefore what will happen after the crisis. I think we have all experienced this in 2008, 2009. Some of the best opportunities in the industry actually come in the years right after a recession. In the recovery, not just assets recover, relationships recover. And very often client acquisitions become faster and opportunities are more abundant. But all of that, the stage for that is set based on how we behave, what we do, and very importantly, what we say during the times of crisis. So we are in a crisis, and communication is, as always, very, very important. It's important to communicate and communicate the right way, and we'll try to describe what the right way means. Because most of all of the relationships we have with clients are about trust. And we said this time and time again in the G2 program. Our client relationships are relationships of trust, and all our communications really have the goal of preserving and enhancing that trust. We said many, many times that trust is like a bank account. You make some deposits when we do something well, when we do something clients didn't expect, where we do something unselfish. And there are some withdrawals. I mean, times when we make mistakes or times when something bad happens. In that concept of the trust bank account, it's as if somebody stole a bunch of that account balance. It wasn't our fault. It wasn't something we did. It wasn't a mistake of ours. But a lot of that balance is gone, and now we have to restore our credibility, and we have to restore the client's confidence in our ability to handle that crisis. So client communications in a time like this really have to do with maintaining our credibility and continuing to assure clients that we know what to do. We may not know exactly what will happen, and we'll emphasize that credibility doesn't mean that we can forecast what's going to happen in the future, or that somehow we can interpret medical information better than anybody else. Credibility simply means that we can take into account what's happening and translate that into sound financial strategies. And by doing so, we can preserve the client's confidence in our relevance in this situation, that not only do we know how to be good financial planners, wealth managers, family office, stewards of client relationships, and so on, but we actually are relevant in this situation. We can actually help, that this is not outside, even though the situation is outside the scope of our control, controlling the damage or controlling the consequences is not, that this is something that we can help with. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to preserve the trust that clients have in us, perhaps even enhance that trust, because as we'll see some evidence and some information that suggests that in a time like this, we also have the opportunity to enhance the trust that clients experience, and ideally we have the opportunity to enhance our reputation. So as we write communications, or as we communicate with clients on the phone, or as we have conversations, probably not in person, because in most states that's actually not something that you can do, our ultimate goal is really to convince internal and external stakeholders that our organization has the understanding, the skills, and the capacity to minimize the negative impact of the crisis, to manage the situation. Purposefully, I want to use that word stakeholders, internal and external. In other words, clients as well as your team. We spoke about this in the last webcast, but as an industry, we kind of have this shortcoming. It's almost part of our personality as an industry. It's part of our character. We have the tendency to be very proactive and very good at reaching out to clients, but very often we forget our own teams. And when we talk about communications, I really want to speak broader, not just to how we reach out to the clients who pay us for what we do, but also for the need to speak in front of your team. Each of you as a G2 member, each of you as a mentor of G2s is a leader in your organization. Your CEOs and CROs, your leaders of departments, your partners, you read client service teams. Those teams need to know what's happening as well. It's not just clients that need to hear from us and hear an interpretation of what this crisis will, how this crisis will impact their portfolios, their retirement plans, their financial plans, the preservation of their wealth. It's also our teams. And we need to recognize and realize that our teams are also asking some very difficult questions. What does this mean for our firm? What does this mean for my career? What does this mean for my job security? What does this mean for my bonus? What does this mean for my promotion? What does this mean to me and my team? And those are questions we need to address. And some of the same fundamental principles that we apply to client communications also apply very well to communicating internally. These are times that have special significance. We need to speak with a tone of voice that has added gravity to it. And we need to communicate honestly, clearly, with a sense of empathy and compassion. And that empathy and compassion should not be just reserved for our clients. It really has to reach out to our teams as well, because they need to hear what we're doing. There's a lot of research that indicates that when things go bad, when the weather is bad, when there's a time of crisis, consumers, regardless of the industry, regardless of the market, regardless of the country almost, pay special attention to what's happening, and their perception of the brand of a company is really defined by how that company reacted in a time of crisis. Something like 85% of global consumers say that time of crisis really define the image of a company, and that is based on a survey done by Deloitte as well as Weber Shandwick, which is a very large PR firm. Unfortunately, though, only about half of the firms in any industry have some kind of a crisis communication playbook, and only about a third of any industry actually practices that playbook, actually practices what they will do if something goes bad, if something goes wrong. And as a result of that, most companies kind of feel like they're prepared, but perhaps not as much as they would like to. On the other hand, though, there's a lot of research and a lot of evidence, and we've accumulated a lot of experience that suggests that some times have special significance, and this is one of them. We've used this book a lot in the G2 program, The Power of Moments, written by Chip and Dan Heath. Both of them are professors in sociology and management, and they basically say that our perception of an experience is not shaped by an average of the sequence of events, but is really shaped by some special moments. Some moments have the power of changing our entire perception of a company, of a firm, of a relationship, of something that happened. So what Chip and Dan Heath were doing was they actually were interviewing people that were leaving the Disney parks. And what they found was that when people leave a Disney park, their perception of that experience wasn't some kind of an average of all the rides that they attended, but it really was perceived very differently. So if you went to a Disney park and you were on, let's say, 10 rides, and you scored every ride on a scale of 1 to 10, the walking out of the park, your perception of how the day went is not going to be driven on the average of every ride that you attended, but instead it's going to be something else. And that something else is, first of all, shaped by the best and the worst moments of that experience. In other words, our clients tend to remember the best of times and the worst of times. That's important to keep in mind, because these are probably some of the worst of times. And the way we handle the worst of times is going to significantly impact the perceptions that clients have of our firm and our ability to handle their financial affairs. Actually, Chip and Dan Heath quote an experiment that was done. Group of volunteers recruited by the psychology department of some university were doing this experiment where they were asking the volunteers to keep their hands submerged in very cold water, something along the lines of 40-degree water. And this is really a test of your pain, your propensity to endure pain, your pain threshold. 40-degree water feels really, really cold and turns very painful fairly quickly. So they were asking the participants to keep their hands submerged in cold water for 2 minutes. It's not excruciating pain, but it's highly uncomfortable experience. Then the same group of people did the same experiment more or less again, except for this time, after 2 minutes of cold water, they actually added some warm water to the mix. So the participants basically experienced the same 2 minutes of cold water and then 30 seconds of lukewarm water. And then after the second experiment, they asked them, which one would you rather do again, the first one or the second one? If you think about it logically, there's no reason to prefer the second one. I mean, the first one is 2 minutes of pain. The second one is 2 minutes of pain followed by 30 seconds of lukewarm. But what they found, to everyone's surprise, is that the vast majority of participants actually preferred the second experiment. Logically, it makes no sense, but what they remembered was not just the worst, but also the fact that it improved at the end. And that's important to remember, that we shape our perception of an event to a significant degree based on how it ends. To quote Shakespeare, all's well that ends well. So a couple of things to really keep in mind as we kind of address this situation is that this is one of those worst of times type of moments. So our handling of this situation will definitely influence client relationships to a very, very significant degree. And it will influence, and this is the point I want to emphasize, how it ends is going to influence not just how clients feel now, but also how they remember this experience. The way they remember this crisis is very important for the future of your firm, for the future propensity of your firm to generate referrals from existing clients, to create opportunities, to expand in your marketplace. There's a lot of research also that suggests the emotionally significant experiences tend to be well remembered. So everyone's going to actually remember what happened during this crisis. Everyone will remember what you said. And that means as you're writing an email or as you're speaking on the phone, you kind of have to keep that in mind, that this email is not as casual as it may have been just 6 months ago, that this phone conversation has added emphasis, that people will definitely remember what happened. And this is perhaps a fantastic opportunity because they will remember all the great things you said, and they will remember how you made them feel better. They will remember all the wise and sage advice that you provided. But also, if we make a mistake, that mistake will be remembered, unfortunately, very, very well. And the good news is that people in a time of crisis tend to come together, that acute stress, times like this, when something bad happens, tend to bring us together. And you probably observe that everywhere you look. When I go to the grocery store, people are just more polite to each other. People help out. They shop and neighbors are checking in on each other, and they shop for elderly neighbors, and everyone's looking to help businesses. Literally, as you know, I own a boxing gym, and the boxing gym has been closed for the last 3 weeks almost. We have people calling and saying, I don't want you to cancel my membership. I want you to charge me in April because I want to make sure that you survive as a business. Those are fantastic reactions. So we have the benefit of that goodwill that's created in a crisis. However, and I'm going to go back to this article at the very end of the presentation, that applies to acute stress, meaning a crisis that's happening right now. And we're going to look at another type of stress at the very end of this presentation that there is a little bit worse news. But what I want you to remember here is that this is a special moment. It has special amount of significance because of that people tend to come together and tend to remember what happened, which means that we need to be communicating very carefully. The good news is that when we did our survey of you, and 57 firms participated in the survey, you have done an outstanding job of communicating to your clients. The vast majority of firms have reached out to their clients either through email or through phone calls or both, most cases both. And you have been very good at talking to clients about what is happening and what this means. There are very few pieces of data in the survey that suggest any kind of improvement, but if I can point at one thing, it's that number at the bottom of the slide. Very few firms, only 2% of firms have actually customized their communications, and this may be a little bit misleading. Obviously, if you make a phone call, that phone call is a customized communication by definition. You're talking to one person at a time. But when firms are sending out emails or updates, very few of those emails or updates have actually been customized to a specific audience. And I want to go back to that and suggest that perhaps they should be. But the good news here is that you are communicating to your clients and you're reaching out and you're sending a lot of messages. And for the most part, those messages have been excellent, but not always. Because of the many, many contacts I have through the G2 program and the years of working in the industry, I am probably part of something like 10,000 CRM databases. So I receive a lot of emails from advisory firms. Every day I get 20, 30 market updates, and I get a lot of newsletters. So I'm very well informed in terms of what's happening. And reading through some of these messages with curiosity, I've seen some very good examples, and I've seen some examples that perhaps can be, let's say, improved. So here's some examples on the left. This one says, "Hi, Philip. The pandemic is here, and we have found ourselves in bear country without enough toilet paper." It's kind of funny, actually. It is kind of funny. Unfortunately, though, I'll probably say, given the gravity of the situation, that may not be the best tone of voice, especially early on. This may not be the best way to start a message. Or take the next one. It says, today fewer than 100 people have been diagnosed with the virus in the United States. That will likely increase, but doesn't seem a bit early for a panic attack. We all need to be prepared and we need to stay alert, but developing a bunker mentality at this point seems premature. That was said about 2 weeks ago, and at this point in time reading it feels like, yeah, you know what, we're all attending this meeting from a bunker of some kind. So that forecast probably didn't play out very well. And then the third message, look at this one, says, friends, I'm upset, fellow Californians, I'm really upset. I'm struggling to comprehend the reaction from society on closing, shutting down from the fear of the sickness. It was sent out on the day Governor Newsom in California actually issued a shelter-in-place order. So that was about 2 weeks ago. It was a firm in California that we've worked with, and it's a personal reaction and it's an emotional reaction, which makes it valid. Obviously, our reactions are our own, but you got to remember when you communicate with clients that you're not just representing yourself. You're also representing your firm, that you're reaching out on behalf of not just your personal background and experience, but you're reaching out as a professional on behalf of an entire firm. And you could look at these messages and say, oh, they're probably written by, some sort of a small, unsophisticated solo person operation. Unfortunately, each and every one of them is coming from at least $1 billion firm with some pretty good-sized marketing departments and resources. So we all make mistakes. As they say somewhere in a good book, you can't throw rocks if you live in a glass house. And we all live in a glass house at the moment. We're all part of this. But as we communicate, communication is a balancing act, and we got to remember that sense of balance. It's very tempting to try to tell clients not to worry, that in trying to alleviate the anxiety, it's very tempting to tell them that this too shall pass and you don't have to worry about it and it's not a big deal. But at the same time, we got to remain objective. We actually got to present the facts as we see them professionally and as they are. It's very tempting to try to provide comfort, but unfortunately the news may be worse than we'd like them to be. It's also very tempting to try to be an expert in something that we're not. And we just got to acknowledge that, first of all, none of us could predict the market. If we could predict the market, we're probably wasting our time here. None of us are also medical experts. And while this industry has a great variety and diversity of talented people, I don't think any of us are doctors. So trying to interpret medical facts, trying to suggest what should be done from an epidemiology standpoint is probably actually counterproductive. Actually, speaking of epidemiologists, I have a funny story for you. Seattle has shelter in place, and we're not allowed to be any closer than 6 feet away from each other, and we're discouraged from social interactions of any kind. But my daughter, actually, who's 15, wanted to go out for a walk with a friend of hers, and so the friend's father drove over, dropped off his daughter, and said, okay, you can go for a walk as long as the two of you keep some distance together, 6 feet. You can kind of walk together but some feet apart, which, giving that advice to 15-year-old girls is somewhat unrealistic, but you can go ahead and do it. And he kind of seemed very strict about, how this should be handled, which is fine. I mean, that's exactly the right way to approach the situation. I was asking my wife, what does he do? Turns out he actually is an epidemiologist. That's actually what he does for a living. So the girls went out for a walk, and they came back at the park, and the father was late picking them up. So I gave him a call, said, hey, we're ready to go. And he said, well, do you mind if you take my daughter with you to your house, and then I'll pick her up from there? I'm wondering, it's like, all right, well, here's the expert advice, except for when he's actually the frustrated parent that's trying to balance taking care of children and professional responsibilities. It's an act of compromise. So even the experts have to compromise in a situation like this. And I don't even know why I'm telling you that story, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it's very tempting to try to provide advice outside of the scope of our expertise, but we shouldn't. And it's also very tempting to try to provide good news. But unfortunately, at the moment, most of what we receive is bad news, and we have to really be treating the bad news with a sense of compassion and a sense of honesty. So kind of compare and contrast the messages on the left with messages on the right. The messages on the right are coming from some firms in Seattle that I actually have frequent interactions with. And read this one, Philip, I wanted to reach out to our loyal group of clients to address the situation with the coronavirus. Every day brings new development related to the virus, and the uncertainty can be unsettling. Our hearts go out to those who have been impacted. Or the other one, coronavirus is on everybody's mind. The markets are volatile. Please know that we're taking all necessary measures to safeguard our crew and the communities we live in, including following all recommended best practices around social distancing. Notice the difference in the tone of voice. Notice the resisted temptation to actually go further than the information will let us. And very importantly, notice the compassion and empathy that is present in both of those messages, because that is very, very important. The good news is, as we said, that clients, for the most part, have reacted very well so far, and I want to emphasize that note, so far. When we ask the question, are clients asking you to make changes, overwhelmingly, you told us that for the most part, only a quarter of our clients are trying to do that. Less than a quarter of our clients are doing that. And when we ask, well, how does their reaction today compare with what experienced in 2008, 2009? Again, the answer is very encouraging. It seems like clients have learned that lesson. And that's very much supported by science as well. We learn very fast in bad times. When we touch a hot plate, we know exactly what happened. We don't do it again for many years. The same has been demonstrated in many experiences, and actually summarized very well in a book called The Power of That by John Turney and Roy Baumeister. In that book, they describe an experiment where they had two groups of kids recruited for an experiment. The kids were answering questions, and the questions were very similar to each other, so you can learn from one question to the next to the next. And the first group of children were rewarded with marbles, because children like marbles. I like marbles too. So the first group of children, every time they answered the question correctly, were given a marble. The second group of children, and this is important to remember, had a box full of marbles given to them in the very beginning of the experiment, and actually when they answered the question wrong, they had to forfeit a marble. They had to give up a marble. So a marble was taken away from them. This is sort of the Eastern European approach to education. You know, you lose something rather than gaining something. Well, interestingly enough, though, the children who were losing marbles seemed to do a lot better than the children who were gaining marbles. The experiment was calibrated so both groups of children should end up with about the same amount of marbles given the number of questions, but they didn't. When we experience something bad, we tend to learn very fast from it, which is kind of the good news and the bad news. It's good news because that means that the bad experience that clients had in 2008 and 2009 has stuck with them, and it's imprinted in their psychology, and they have learned what is a good reaction and what's not such a good reaction. It's not so good news because this very powerfully once again speaks to the loss aversion theory, which we're very, very well aware of. So when we address our audiences, when we're looking at how we communicate with clients, we need to show a very keen understanding of who they are and what they experience. And this is a very good place to remember client segmentation and perhaps not treat all clients the same way. It's really interesting. Almost every single firm that we work with has some kind of client segmentation methodology. Some clients get a postcard for Christmas and the holidays. Others get a gift basket. Some clients are invited to an event and others are not. Some clients get 3 phone calls a year and others get 2, and some clients get the good wine and others not so good. Interestingly enough, though, when we write emails, we forget everything about client segmentation and we just send out the same email to everyone. And if I can make one correction to what we see in the survey information, that will be it. We need to actually use our client segmentation, and not just who are the largest clients or who are the smallest clients, but also we need to realize that the way clients are impacted by the crisis is not the same. If someone is in retirement, they probably have more risk, just physical risk. Literally, they're more at risk from the virus, and they probably experience the decline in their assets differently than someone who's 40 years old and has a lot of time left. Very importantly, someone who has a business and that business has been shut down for the last 3 weeks, thankfully just 3 weeks, not 3 months, probably has a very different reaction than someone that works in, say, technology. Some industries have really been challenged by this. There are firms that work, for example, with airline pilots. There are firms that work with hospitality executives. So not every client is impacted the same way, and not every client feels the same way. So as we reach out to clients, perhaps the first few waves of communication are standard. Everyone gets the same email. But as we kind of go deeper into this crisis, I would strongly encourage you to start looking at segments of clients, not just the economic segments, but also the way in which clients have been impacted, and perhaps we can start customizing our message. Unfortunately, though, only 2% of firms have done that. The vast majority of firms have sent the same email to everyone. Now, that said, I'm not trying to criticize here. On the contrary, trying to empathize. Because at the end of the day, most of you have made hundreds, if not even thousands of phone calls. Every firm has reached out and called a lot of clients. And those are custom messages. I mean, when you reach out to someone individually, those messages are incredibly appreciated. You've seen this quote before from William James, but we all desire to be appreciated and recognized for the individual that we are. Remember, we talked in the G2 program about how the Ritz-Carlton trains people to use your name because people respond so favorably to being recognized as unique. We need to add that element of uniqueness to our communications. We need to tell each and every client that while we're dealing with this situation, we remember who they are, and we're trying to deal with their unique circumstances and the unique characteristics, not just of who they are in terms of financial strategies and in terms of portfolio strategies, but who they are as a person as well. In other words, we need to reach out with a sense of empathy and a sense of compassion for how they feel and their condition, not just the financial facts. And this is perhaps a danger, and forgive me for skipping a couple of slides, is it's very easy to get very technical, and it's very easy to start throwing statistics at clients and saying, okay, you know, the last 10 recessions that we've seen, this is how they recovered, and did you know that 5 of the best or the worst days were in something like that? This is fantastic information that everyone should hear, but statistics also don't supplement the sense of empathy and compassion, that we experience what they're experiencing, that we recognize their emotions, and we recognize the negative emotions too, that there is anxiety there, there's fear there. And depending on who the client is, that sense of anxiety and fear may be amplified by their circumstances. It's very important to be proactive and timely, and I can say I'm incredibly impressed by how quickly firms are reacting. I mean, literally, as soon as the CARES Act was passed, I started receiving messages that had to do with how the CARES Act may impact different groups of clients, including particularly business owners. And you have been very, very proactive in making phone calls. Actually, a good friend of mine said that, you know, he said we are proud that we made a lot more phone calls than we received, that we reach out to a lot more clients before they even reached out to us. That said, it should be balanced against maybe being overly communicative. Sometimes I get 3 to 4 messages a day from the same firm. In some ways, if we're communicating too much or too often, that may communicate also a sense of anxiety. It may be a little bit of an overkill. So we need to temper the frequency of communications, and then we also, very importantly, have to be honest. Honest as in what we control and don't control, what we know and don't know. How long is this going to last? We don't know. How bad is it going to be? We don't know. What shape the recession will take, we don't exactly know. Particularly true when we're communicating internally, not just with clients, but we are communicating to our teams. What do we know so far? We know so far that this is not going to be a great year. And we know that we will experience some financial challenges. And we know that we are going to have to work harder than we have before. And we know that there is danger. We don't know that for certain, but we know there is danger, that we'll have to cancel bonus plans, that we will have to cancel pay increases, that we may have to even take deeper and worse steps than that. It's very important to maintain, in order to maintain our credibility, to be honest in our communications. We can't really rush and make predictions that we just don't have the right information for and are outside the scope of our expertise. And really, when we look at how doctors deliver bad news, and a sociologist by the name of Douglas Maynard has studied that, what they find is that exactly those components are very important. There has to be honesty, there has to be empathy. They found that the doctors who are best at delivering bad news were doctors that were not following a script. That the script sends the wrong message. The script sends a message of mechanical communication without empathy, without compassion. Doctors who were best at it actually used a different three-step approach. The first one was that they, rather than using a script, they very carefully monitored the reaction of the patient. They basically modified their message based on the reaction of the patient, which basically means in a crisis like this, individual communications are very beneficial. They're very good because they allow us to observe the client and react to what they're experiencing. Doctors that were good at this also made sure that the client, the patient, is proactive in the communication, that they're not just a passive recipient. In other words, they encourage questions and they encourage reactions. They would ask questions such as, what is your perspective? How does that feel? What questions come to your mind as you hear these news? So rather than turning our clients into a passive audience, we need to communicate, but we also need to absorb the reaction very quickly and then offer secondary and tertiary communications based on that reaction. And then very importantly, doctors that delivered the bad news well tended to also not sweep it under the carpet and kind of rush to turn the page. They also tended to stay on topic and tolerate even the awkward silence, because that meant that there's still more to explore, there's still more to talk about. And I know it's really tempting for all of us to not be the bearer of bad news, and to try to kind of jump into something positive and run away from the negative. I mean, so much of our training has been conditioning us to really focus on the positive, but the reality is that sometimes they're bad news, and those bad news have to be dwelled upon and they have to be examined. And sometimes we have to communicate in a way perhaps that's not ideal, but we have to be empathetic and sympathetic to what the clients are experiencing. And, you know, we just so wired to avoid losses. If you need another example of that, 93% of PhD students actually registered early when there was a penalty for late registration, but only 67% took advantage of a discount for early registration. In other words, chances are when we describe what's about to happen, what might happen, we may be better off using that loss aversion to our advantage, and framing our message in such a way, rather than trying to tempt clients with what the opportunity is in the recovery and trying to sort of make lemonade out of this and tell them all the good things that might happen. We may actually use that loss aversion and try to steer them away from experiencing losses that will happen if they perhaps prematurely sell investments that they shouldn't. It's a difficult situation, and it's something that's happening to all of us. We are experiencing this together as an industry, and this is perhaps part of the power of the G2 communities. We have the ability to share with each other and share experiences and share best practices and learn from each other. And as we said, in bad times, we actually learn very quickly. So to help us with that, we actually invited someone who's been a big part of the G2 program and a participant in it as well. It's called Slater in Fidelity, works with a lot of firms through Fidelity and has kind of very broad observations across the entire industry. So Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Philip, thanks very much for asking me.
Absolutely. Scott, you work with firms of almost every size and kind in the industry. You work with smaller and larger RIAs, with family offices. You work with wealth management, financial planning, investment management firms. Fidelity works with retirement plans as well. Kind of what do you see across the industry? What is the industry broadly doing to tackle this crisis and communicate better?
I think, first of all, you outlined it pretty well in terms of the mechanics of it. I think, first of all, I compare it to even going back to the period, it's more than 11 years ago now, with 2008. I found that many of, at the time, the RIAs that I worked with, as a group, they weren't as quick to act on responding beyond phone calls or taking phone calls. I think they've learned from that experience and are largely, to a firm, everyone's reaching out and contacting them and speaking to them. And I just like you, I'm also receiving plenty of, I think, largely well done communications in terms of email blasts and so on. So in terms of just a reaction and getting in touch with their clients and caring about them, I think we're seeing a lot of that activity happen very effectively right now. And I would say that's across large and small enterprises.
Fantastic. Scott, what is one thing that you observe that firms can improve? What is perhaps a common mistake that you bump into as you practice in the advice firms?
I was interested in some of what you were talking about, the importance of using your segmentation. And you're right, it's not just about the size or the most valuable clients first in terms of their revenue stream, but it's also segmenting based on behavior. Certain people are going to be reacting differently. I would also encourage advisors. I mean, some of the work we've done at Fidelity through our Center for Family Engagement, we've done a fair amount of research on kind of how to engage and interact with families on that front. I really do think that learning how to slow down and ask better questions and open-ended questions. And I would say how and what kind of questions as opposed to why do you feel that way? Because why tends to, I'm getting a little psychological here, but why tends to put you a little bit on the defensive. So ask, how is this affecting you? And what are you experiencing out of this, both for you and your family? I think one other element that a lot of firms need to remember is, and this is kind of how I've talked about it with clients. Let's think about what's happened in the month of March alone. In March, everybody all of a sudden realized, my gosh, this is rolling across the country. And I think it hit you first, really, in terms of one of the areas, Philip, right there in Seattle. It's rolling across the country and it's coming much faster and bigger than we ever expected. All of a sudden, I'm moving my business home. My kids are home from school. My kids are home from college. All of a sudden, we're on top of each other. And we then have a market meltdown, and I have to start thinking about communication. So what does all that lead to? An understandable react. And I just encourage firms, now that we're on the last day of March, do like what they do in the military and do a stand-up after-action review, just to objectively together say, what did we really do well in this communication? What did we hear from clients? Where could we get a little bit better? What are one or two things we can do more effectively? That's the first thing I'd say. I would also say the second thing is, beyond just reacting, how can you get on top of the communication wave, if you will, for, let's just say, the month of April and May? You don't know what's going to happen yet, but what's the cadence that you want that to be? You talked about frequency a little bit. And by the way, what mediums do you want to use? It goes beyond just your phone calls and your emails and your email blasts. But, one of the things I've even suggested on a simple level is video brings your personality out much better. I mean, and everybody thinks, well, I've got to get a videographer. No, you've got the kids are home now. Hand them the iPhone, take your letter and read the letter and let your personality come out a little bit, and your kids will, believe me, they know how to do this stuff. They'll coach you through it. But I think it honestly brings out your personality, which brings me to my final point, which is, how can you engage clients at a different level? I mean, this is a really unique time in our experience for all of us, because we're isolated. Now, for some people, that's okay, but for others, they're alone, and they really need that interaction and that sense of connection and community. And where better to get it than from their financial advisor? I mean, this points again to what we do in financial advice is far more than just managing money and achieving goals and doing planning. It's actually trying to help people really engage and accomplish what they want out of life. Right now, they've lost their sense of peace of mind, but by engaging them at that level, creating an online event, the same events that you might have done in person, create an online event that you could do through Zoom or through many of the technologies that are there, and figure out how to bring that together. Or all these people, one last thing I'd say is, all these people, like, for instance, they've got their kids at home and now they're learning how to be home educators on top of trying to run their business. Well, what could you do as an advisor to maybe give them either some resources or some ideas to help them kind of engage their younger kids, stuff like that. So begin to think about the situation that your clients are in personally, not just their financial situation, which is real, but the lives they're living right now and how that's not going to change for a little while. And you can be much more engaged. And going back to your very first point, this is the point where, moments of truth that you really can set yourself apart and help your clients, and, potentially even get referrals, because you've in an emotional moment, you've really set yourself apart.
Very much. So many questions come to mind, but you mentioned that, your kids and video and social media. I'm very much second that notion. My daughter is constantly on her phone, and she's really skilled at this stuff. That said, though, in our survey, we asked advisors, how have you communicated? And very few actually mentioned social media. The use of social media has been also almost minimal. Why is that? I mean, it sounds like a great time to do it, but advisors for the most part have shied away from any of the social media platforms.
I'm actually not too surprised by that for a couple of reasons. One is I think as an industry, we're not as experienced in using it massively. And so, when we're under pressure like this, I think everybody goes back to their default, which is control it through email and so on. That's one level. But the other part is, depending on which channel we're talking about, I think people are very attentive to wanting to manage that message effectively and use it well. But I do think, using the more serious channels like a LinkedIn, if you do have a post there, you're reaching a lot of professionals there. And if you want to alert them to maybe a webinar like you're doing here, that you're doing, or you want to communicate some point of view about a written document, I think it's fine to use that, and perhaps Twitter to a limited degree. But I think it also points to another issue, which is, you raised it too. It's how much communication is too much. I saw a great cartoon the other day that showed a wife looking at her computer, and she turns to her husband and said, I've got an email here from a firm that we gave a company that we bought something from 4 years ago and gave our email address to, that they're concerned for us and here for us at this time. Everybody's getting those. And so I think it's trying to strike the right amount and balance of communication and which vehicle. And, people ask me then, well, how much is too much? Or how do I know? Well, ask your clients. Well, which medium does it help you to hear the most? Do you want to get my daily email blast? Does it help you? I think you got to do enough that you're that you want to establish yourself as the definitive voice in the mind of your client, because you're talking to them for 20 minutes, or you're sending them an email blast. But guess what? They're looking at CNBC and cable and internet and talking to family, for hours longer than you're ever going to be there. So how do you make sure that your message is effective and meaningful? And I don't think it's necessarily about tons of frequency unless the client tells you that.
We said in the beginning, this is not just about talking to clients, but it's also talking to your team. And the same exact principles could apply to communications, whether you're communicating internally or externally. What have you seen in terms of firms communicating internally? I mean, it's very difficult. We haven't had a staff meeting in quite some time in the Ensemble practice. It's difficult for teams to come together physically. In most states, that actually would be legal. You can't really do happy hour together staring at each other on a computer. How can you keep morale high in a time where everybody's working hard and maybe not feeling so good about it? What are some of the best communication practices internally?
Well, just before I joined you on this call, Philip, I just finished watching, and I think we get these almost twice a week now, but I just watched a video which Abby Johnson hosted with our head of HR and our head of, head of security, giving us an update on what they have been doing around everything from things they're providing for us from an HR perspective, how we have moved. I think it's 97% of Fidelity employees are now working from home, which is pretty amazing, and how they have adapted, even how they're trying to work with clients and the branches and everything else. That is hugely benefit. Also, what they're doing around hiring plans, what they're doing around looking forward, and that this isn't just about hunkering down. So that level of communication, again, on a large corporate level, has been very effective. But I would also say, I actually do find the happy hour things. We've done a little bit of that internally, and it's kind of fun. Because we had everybody across the country, it was, quote, breakfast, lunch, depending where you were. Well, guess what? People's kids are home. The next thing we're doing, we're getting introduced to the kids. People are asking about them. And it was way more fun than actually I thought, just from a engagement standpoint, because we're all in this together. But then the last thing, I guess, from a leadership standpoint, communicate, regularly what the main things people want to hear. I think that transparency and frequency, inside really matters. Here's what we're hearing from clients. how and actually give that back to people further down the organization. We need some help to figure out how can we better engage with them, or how can we communicate this more effectively, and try to engage some creativity and this is when I think a lot of creativity happens. I mean, a lot of the most creative technology businesses started in 1976 in the middle of a recession. You got Microsoft and Apple and everything else. So now let's reinvent your own business and your own service model internally with your teams now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Scott. And I'm smiling because, the entire presentation, I didn't get any questions, but the moment I mentioned happy hour, I got at least 3 people texting me saying, no, you can do happy hour online. So very much there's a consensus. That's been tried and that's been tested, and it seems to work very well. Thank you so much, and look forward to future conversations. And let me just kind of quickly summarize everything we've talked about, and with the intention of wrapping up the message as well. We all hate delivering bad news. Actually, back in ancient Egypt, they used to throw the bearers of bad news to the crocodiles. Like, literally, that's where the expression, the bearer of bad news, comes from. Unfortunately, we have the aversion of being that bearer of bad news, but that theory is perhaps unfounded, because what we find is that actually clients appreciate it, and clients appreciate the honesty, and clients appreciate the candor, and clients appreciate receiving the message directly from the source. At this point in time, we probably should give up the notion that we're going to be source of news. Clients have very active access to all kinds of news, and everything moves in real time. So the messaging that we send out, the things that we communicate, are probably not news to them. What is important, though, is that we communicate what this means and how this means, what this means to them in particular, how they should be processing this crisis, what this crisis means. We need to acknowledge the severity of this crisis, that this is not something trivial. This is not something that will go away very quickly. We also need to restate our commitment that we will continue to be there in times good or bad, and we'll continue to take care of our clients and our teams. Once again, we need to restate that commitment to our teams as well, that as much as we can, as best as we can, we'll continue taking care of our teams. And we'll continue looking for their well-being, we'll continue looking for their health, we'll continue making sure that their employment is secure and their careers are secure as much as we can, and we have to be very honest about that as well. We got to talk about the things we do, and sometimes it's very tempting to maybe, because actions are always more visible than the lack thereof, but sometimes not doing something is the best decision to make, so we got to be very proactive in that as well. And as we said, most firms have been very, very good about reaching out, and a lot of activity has already happened. As we kind of get deeper and deeper in this crisis, though, there are a couple of things that we need to learn. We need to learn from our mistakes, things that we haven't done so well. Things like informal tone of communication, things like rushing to action, things like trying to predict and kind of succumbing to that temptation to create a forecast where we really can't do one. A big mistake is also, making all these communications and not documenting them in any way. Scott mentioned that as well, is that when we hear something on a phone call, it needs to go in the CRM. When we receive an email, we need to learn from that email. We need to schedule some meetings absorbing this information, because we will need to continue communicating, and that won't stop, and won't stop for a while. We mentioned this article in the beginning that said that in times of acute stress, human beings come together and we unite, and we tend to behave better than we normally do. Unfortunately, in the same article, they quote some research that in times of chronic stress, the opposite happens. We start to get tired, we start wearing out. And those of you that remember 2008, 2009 will remember that feeling as well. Unfortunately, as time goes on, what was initially a positive and constructive reaction starts getting a little more anxious and start getting a little more edgy and a little more nervous. And even clients that were very rational in the beginning start wondering if this is going to continue. Kind of, if you've ever been on a boat in like a yacht or something in a choppy ocean, at first only 1 or 2 people look a little green and go to the back of the boat. But as time goes by, more and more people go to the back of the boat, especially as you watch others kind of look not so well. And unfortunately, we may go through some period of time like this. So it's very important that we learn from our early experiences, that we segment our clients, not just by wealth and how much they pay us, but also how they react to this crisis, as Scott mentioned, and also what their needs are. It's very important that we continue acting with compassion and empathy. it's very important that we also maintain our own emotional energy. And that's my last message for you. You are professionals and you're leaders, and you will spend a lot of your day, you already are, assuring others that everything will be fine and assuring others that we can tackle this and we can take this. And you got to somehow find a way to also replenish your emotional energy. Whatever you do, whether that's playing a musical instrument or riding a bike, whatever you do, whether that's spending time at home, cooking, or family, keep your own emotional well-being in check as well. Don't get tired, because you will. One thing we learned in 2008 and 2009 is that even the most confident of advisors will have some times of doubt. And when you have those times of doubt, I mean, remember, you have an entire community supporting you. Don't hesitate. Reach out to each other as G2s. Reach out to us. That's what Slack is really good for, and you'll find some resources there. But let's continue talking to each other. In times of storm, boats come together to seek safety numbers. We can do this together. Thank you so much for joining us today. I don't see any questions. But I assume that that's only because you've reserved them for an email that you're going to send me after this call. Thank you so much for being part of this. And once again, don't be strangers. We plan to do this again in another 3 to 4 weeks from now. This time we want to talk about morale and maintaining team morale. So hope to see you on that webcast as well. Hope everybody is safe and sound, and look forward to the next conversation, hopefully under better circumstances. Have a good one.